Another packed house. You guys are popular. Thank you, everybody, for coming out to hear our conversation on shifting from job-based to skills-based organizations. Thank you both for being here. And since we don't have a lot of time, I'm going to once again just dive right into my questions. Kit, first question is for you. You work with a lot of clients in your capacity as the head of organization and culture design at Co-Collective. And you're seeing some of the challenges and struggles that they're facing on the ground every day when it comes to embracing a whole new way of working. Can you give us a little bit of a preview of the conversations that you're hearing right now on that topic with your clients?
Yeah, thank you for asking, Jared. All right, so in my day job, I work as the managing director of organization and culture design, as Jared mentioned, and we're working with clients on a day-to-day basis, trying to think about what does the future of work look like? How do you think about the systems and structures and the organizational systems needed in order to embrace a new way of working? The biggest thing that we're seeing from our clients right now is the focus on contribution. So when we talk about skills-based versus jobs-based organization, there's a question of how do we enable people to contribute in a more hybrid world? How do we enable them to contribute asynchronously by not being in person? How do we enable them to optimize contribution when they're in person? So the big question is how do we redefine this idea of value and open up opportunities for people to contribute in different ways?
Fantastic. And yes, that description that she's giving is kind of has shaped your career in a very specific way.
Yeah.
How important has it been to you personally to be seen for what you can do, not what's on your resume?
No, I think it's actually been quite fundamental for me. By background, I don't think I was sort of the typical profile that most people would think of when they think of finance, tech, and originally in automotive. I think a lot of what I learned throughout the journey, and especially within tech companies and startups, was that skills were valued, execution of those skills were valued much higher than maybe years of experience. Now, as we scaled every organization or as we grew the company, years of experience and just seeing things as they go were really necessary and impactful. But ultimately, the baseline of what's made my career in every company that I've worked for has been just actually having the both soft skills and hard skills to be able to weather any storm or develop any product.
Well, I think as time goes on, we're learning the value of being able to balance both the hard skills and the soft skills, being more than just what it says on your resume,
Sure.
Years of experience, age, things like that. But that's a big change for most organizations. That's a whole new way of evaluating people, a whole new way of organizing talent and skills. And again, Kit, this is something that your clients are dealing with every day. How are they managing that challenge, and how significant of a change do they see it as?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the one thing I'll start with is I noticed you made the distinction between hard and soft skills. My team gives me a very hard time about this, but I actually can't stand the distinction of soft and hard skills. I think it's really important to say that if you say hard skills, automatically people put a value on hard skills, saying like technical skills are most important and soft skills are really sort of the added subjective skills. There's really nothing subjective about extraordinary leadership, empathetic leadership. That's one of the hardest and most challenging skills to see. And so I really always kind of challenge that provocation, like hard
Maybe
and
we
soft
should
skills.
rebrand it.
Let's rebrand it.
I'm down. Yes.
I'm totally there. We'll figure that out. We can call it something else. But hard and soft is always tricky for me. So, but to answer your question, actually, thinking about how organizations are grappling with that, I think one of the biggest things we're hearing from organizations right now is we don't have sufficient management training. And that's been a problem for some time, but I think what's really interesting right now about management in kind of a post-pandemic world is management in a remote and hybrid context is a different type of management. So if we were already at a deficit of what great management looked like, we're at an extraordinary deficit of what management in a world where you're required to communicate and collaborate at an exponential altitude. And so what we're encouraging people to do is really think about the investments that you're making in very strong leadership, strong management with an emphasis on communication and collaboration.
Are you finding that there's a willingness and an enthusiasm around making that change and seeing it in that way, or are you still finding a lot of pushback?
Yeah, I mean, the annoying answer for everyone is it depends, right? It depends. We're working with a client that's a growing startup, a scaling startup right now, and I have been so impressed by their CEO with his emphasis on both the cultural elements and the business outcomes elements. And to me, what he embodies is this idea of it is just as important to think about your culture and to think about how you're using and leveraging your culture to fuel business outcomes, because at the end of the day, they are a virtuous cycle. So the leaders that recognize that and see that as a virtuous system, those are the ones that to me are creating the most powerful impact today.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, just to bring it back to you for a minute, you described your career as being in, you said finance, automotive, and technology, and those are three very male-dominated industries.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask, first of all, how did you break in? How did you sort of get the respect that you deserve? And what advice do you have for other women in the audience who might be in similarly, male-dominated situations?
Yeah, no, such a loaded question, so I'm going to try and answer as best as possible. I think
that's my job.
I think from my perspective, some of the most impactful journeys I've been on is because other men have put me in the room. I'm very lucky to have worked with folks who saw my skills and the impact that I could bring to an organization just at brass tacks, instead of what I looked like, what I seemed like, or what sort of their maybe personal biases were. Now, I think that that's really rare, and I think how we change that is actually systemic. I think at this level, it's really hard to actually find the talent who wants to actually come in and be in those industries or drive impact in those industries because they don't feel as welcome. And I think the only way we change that is actually being highly intentional, right? And as we are intentional, trying to understand who is the best for the job. And who is best for the job isn't always the resume. It isn't always the experience. It's the skills that they're bringing to the table. Whether we like the word soft or hard skills, we debate that later. I think what it means though is, do you enjoy working with that person? Does that person intellectually challenge you? Do they bring something to the table that you don't get to think about on a daily basis? That is what makes A players, and that's what allows organizations to scale. And so whether it's a male-dominated industry or not, if there are people around you that are constantly making you think and expand your horizons on how to do your job and how to grow your business, you're more likely going to bring them in and give them a seat at a table than thinking about maybe your gender bias or whatever it may have you.
It's a great answer to a big question, so thank you very much. And just to take that one step further though, in that way, does shifting the focus from job-based and sort of job title-based to more skills-based and outcome-based organizations, does that further diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives? Is that sort of one of the pieces in the broader push, broader strategy for furthering DEI?
No, so I think it sort of depends as well. And the reason why I say that is because our education system in many of the countries that all of you represent today, as well as in America and so on, I think it's fundamentally broken and systemic. So being a female in those sort of infrastructures can be even hard to garner those skills and have that access. But I think how we change that is through technology, right? No one within technology actually requires you to have that level of access that you may have needed sort of in a more old world view. I think that the skills that people are able to learn through technology platforms, through engineering, through marketing, finance, whatever it may have you, now that's available online, and also through some of the most amazing companies that a lot of folks that are here at Web Summit are building, I think is going to allow for more access, and that access will allow for more skilled individuals to come to play. I think the biggest thing I will challenge the audience on is that as you think about building your workforce or the culture that you're building in your company, one of the first things we did at Pipe was say that a degree was not required. It was not required. We tried to pull that out of the bias in the system. Now, did most people end up having one over time? Sure. But believe it or not, our heads of design, dropouts. So a couple of our found outs, founders, dropouts. Folks that have been some of the highest skilled. So I've got PhDs in our company. I think from our perspective, we really tried to hone in on the skills, and as a result, have been able to pull in more diversity. And I think over time, hopefully bring in more gender neutral sort of
So the message to the students out there is if you want to get ahead, get the hell out of school. No, I'm kidding.
Absolutely not.
No,
Don't tell your parents I said
don't.
that.
No, I'm going to get in trouble. Taking what Yaz was just saying, but from a different perspective, is there a way in which you're helping your clients transition to a completely different way of working towards more outcome-based, but is there a danger of having, introducing new biases and, new inequalities in that transition?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think it's really nuanced, right? I mean, Yaz talked about the idea that there's great kind of opportunities for equity and equality introduced by video calling, right? We've heard a ton of feedback, and the research shows that video calls actually tend to be a more equitable experience if you're all on video. So you all are the same size, share a voice is a lot easier, right? So you have this kind of level playing field. But what ends up happening too is you're not necessarily at the entry levels in an organization exposed to kind of the happenings and the inner workings of things that you're not directly invited to. And so that becomes, again, opportunities for inequity. One thing that hits close to home, I'm a working mom, I have a 21-month at home, and being pregnant, having a young son at home during the pandemic, being able to do all of my work, both whether it's on my full-time job or my board commitments from home, enabled me to do so much more, enabled me to have extraordinary flexibility, enabled me to transition back into the workforce in a completely different way. And I know that the opportunities opened up by remote and flexible working really benefit different parties that aren't the traditionally male-dominated workforce. And yet, there are also inequities around the boundary blurring that happens in working and kind of the triple peak workday. So it's presenting a lot of opportunities and some downsides. The question is, how do we amplify those equity opportunities, and how do we minimize the inequities that it could create?
Well, there's one group in the workforce as well that is often overlooked, but I think some of the transition that we're talking about and this new approach that we're talking about might actually further disadvantage, and those are the youngest employees, the new hires. We discussed this before, that so much learning comes from that one-on-one mentorships, that in-person observation, that being in the culture. And do you feel like young people, specifically new hires, even that are older in age, are at a disadvantage in these organizations as they're looking to transition to this future of work that you're describing?
Yeah, so Yaz said it well. I mean, the idea of intentionality is so critical when you're thinking about hybrid work or any work culture design. And one of the things that is happening, we're hearing both from the organizations we work with and the research that's being done, that, as Jared mentioned, folks who are entry level are not getting to see things happen in the halls. They're not going to witness some of the key discussions that might influence and shape their careers. So you really have to think about what are the intentional programs you put in place to mitigate that. One example, just to share with you, so I sit on the board of Women in Innovation, which is this global nonprofit focused on helping close the gender equity gap in the innovation sector. And we have a fellowship program where we take women who are right out of school or still in school, and we have them follow along with the senior teams that are doing some of the most critical work. And then while they're doing that, they have the opportunity to gain the mentorship, but also be exposed to the critical conversations that enable you to supercharge your career in that context. So you have to think about what are the programs that we might not have needed in the past that we really need now.
Yeah, and yes, do you have any examples of those?
Yeah, no, I was going to actually jump in because I couldn't agree more. So I am fundamentally sitting here today because somebody, like I said, put me in the room to allow me to hear conversations that maybe typically I wouldn't have been allowed to hear, or wouldn't have been the typical profile of the person that would be in that room. So by way of background, I am the CMO and head of IR at Pipe, but prior to that I was mostly in investor relations, which meant I raised a lot of equity and debt capital. But believe it or not, before I raised any capital, I didn't have a finance background. I didn't study finance in school. I didn't have those contexts that I think a lot of folks need when they're raising lots of capital. And what I realized is that if I was in the room, I was able to contextualize a lot of the conversations. Yes, while I learned how to read a P&L or understand what advance rates meant or dilution, contextualizing it in the room, there is nothing quite like it. And so even today, while we're a fully remote company, I would say 60% of us are in the US, 40% now in all throughout Europe and the UK.
Yeah.
We have to be highly intentional that the people still get access to those types of conversations. And so how we are intentional and how we think about it is that I personally, for example, fly into the London team about once every 2 months. I take them personally to these meetings with me, whether it's applicable to their job or not. I spend time in person to walk them through why we think about how we capitalize our business, for example, or why we've decided to do a certain campaign. And I think that cannot be something that's dismissed over time. I think a remote culture and remote work is fantastic in a lot of ways, but it does take away a time and a place where we all had the ability to be exposed both audibly as well as in person that we don't get to do as much today. But for just to even put a finer tune point on it, after spending time in the rooms, after being empowered to learn how to raise capital, I raised a little over $500 million of equity and $1.4 billion of debt, right? That's insane for someone who doesn't come from that background. And I remember thinking to myself, if somebody hadn't put me in the room to think about structures, how to capitalize businesses, how to expose investors to the right parts of my business, then I would have never known how to capitalize a business ever. And so I think that's really, really important that we continue to expose the workforce, no matter if you're in person or remote.
Yeah, fantastic. So even as organizations are moving to become more remote, it's often the approach there's an all or nothing. We're going to be fully remote, we're going to be fully in person, or even a hybrid approach. It seems like there's one way and no other sort of flexibility. It sounds like you're advocating for the importance of continuing that in-person interaction, especially when it comes to learning opportunities, even in a fully remote organization. Is that correct?
No, I think that's right. I think though, I think we should all be a little bit kinder to ourselves. We went through something called a pandemic. We all tried to stand up our businesses, capitalize our businesses, and build pretty amazing workforces it was very hard to do in a standardized format, right? And I think right now we're also going through a new wave of what does that look like? Is it hybrid? Is it fully remote? Is it completely in person? I don't think we quite know the answer to that yet, but I do know, again, going back to intention, to really listen to the ground. Believe it or not, your employees want to be heard. They want to tell you what works for them and what doesn't. And then the goal should be to find something that does actually continue to make them exceptional executors and to really enjoy the culture. And if that means 6 offsites a year, or that means small micro hubs in areas of a high density location of employees, or if that means eventually a year or two transition to be in person, should be really open to that. I think no one has the silver bullet answer here, and I think we should be really kind to ourselves through the process.
Fantastic. Any final thoughts, of advice for us?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what you're saying around the intentionality, and I think at the end of the day, sometimes we overcomplicate it, and sometimes we oversimplify it. So, we oversimplify it by saying to be or not to be in the office, right? That's an oversimplification of the question. And we overcomplicate it by thinking it's not just about how relationships are built, right? When we are working based on relationships, we need to collaborate, we need to create things, we need to build things. And so how do you build relationships? And to me, there's a lot of ways to build relationships. Really amazing relationships are built and flourish online. Really amazing relationships are built in person, but all of relationships are built on shared experience.
Yes.
And so when you think about designing a culture, when you think about designing a community, how do you create shared experiences, whether that's working alongside each other on a project, or whether that's a shared experience of being together in person and sharing an experience, like coming to Web Summit, for instance. That is what strengthens the relationships that enables you to actually deliver really strong value.
Fantastic. Well, I hope we've left the audience with some actionable advice that they can take home with them. Thank you both so much for being here. Thank you all for coming out.
Yeah.